When Sheriff Thomas Kane discovered that desperate father, Jeremiah Collins, was selling his 19-year-old daughter, Sarah, to the highest bidder like livestock, he knew the territorial laws were being broken. But his solution involved placing his own grandmother's gold ring on the young woman's finger. Would this act of protection become something deeper? Or had the sheriff just traded one form of captivity for another? A scream shattered the morning silence across the Wyoming plains. But it came from a hawk diving for prey, not from the girl pressed against the cabin window who wished she could fly away just as easily. Sarah Mae Collins watched that hawk disappear into the endless blue sky of October 1878, envying its freedom more than she'd ever envied anything in her 19 years of life. The glass felt cold against her cheek, colder than the fear that had been growing in her belly since yesterday when she'd heard her father whispering with strangers in hushed, urgent voices. "Girl, stop your daydreaming and get over here." Jeremiah Collins called from behind her, his words slurred from the bottle he'd been nursing since dawn. "We got important matters to discuss." Sarah's bare feet stayed planted on the rough wooden floor. Something in her father's voice made her stomach twist like a snake. She'd heard that tone before, the same one he'd used when he sold their last cow, their mother's china, and everything else of value they'd once owned. The one-room cabin smelled of stale whiskey, burnt coffee, and something else Sarah couldn't name, but that made her want to run. Through the cracked walls, she could hear the October wind howling across the prairie like a warning. The drought had lasted 3 months now, turning their wheat fields into dust and their hopes into ash. "Sarah Mae, I ain't gonna ask again." She turned slowly, her mother's silver locket heavy against her throat. The locket was the only pretty thing she owned, the only thing her father hadn't sold yet. Inside it was a tiny picture of her mother, who died when Sarah was 12, leaving behind only the locket and words that still echoed in Sarah's memory. "Remember, little star, you're worth more than anyone might try to pay for you." Her father sat hunched over their wobbly kitchen table, counting coins with shaking fingers. His hair had gone completely gray in the past year, and his clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame. The man who'd once lifted her high in the air and called her his sunshine now looked at her like she was something he needed to get rid of. "Sit down, daughter." Jeremiah's voice was quieter now, but no less frightening. "We need to talk about your future." Sarah remained standing. "What kind of future, Papa?" "The kind that'll save us both from starving." He swept the coins into a small pile, only $17 and some change. Not nearly enough to pay what they owed the bank. "You're 19 now, old enough to be married and settled." The word married hit Sarah like a physical blow. She dreamed of marriage, of course, but in her dreams, it involved love and choice and a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. Not whatever her father was planning with that desperate look in his eyes. "I don't want to get married yet, Papa. Maybe in a few years." "We don't have a few years." Jeremiah slammed his fist on the table, making the coins jump. "The bank wants their money by month's end, or we lose everything. The land, the cabin, everything your mother and I worked for." Sarah's heart began beating so fast she thought it might burst. "But Papa, surely there's another way. I could find work in town, or we could sell." "Sell what?" Her father's laugh was bitter as medicine. "Look around, girl. What's left to sell?" Sarah's eyes swept their tiny home. The furniture was broken or gone. The walls were bare except for water stains. Even their cooking pots had been traded away. Only her mother's locket remained, and she clutched it tighter, knowing that if her father noticed it, he might try to sell that too. "There's a man coming today," Jeremiah continued, his voice gentler now but somehow more frightening. "A good man with money and land of his own. He's looking for a wife, and he's willing to pay handsomely for the right girl." The words, "pay handsomely," echoed in Sarah's head like thunder. Her father wasn't talking about a marriage. He was talking about a sale. "Papa, you can't mean—" "I mean to do what's best for both of us." Jeremiah stood up, swaying slightly. "This man, Ezra Hutchins, he's got a mining claim up north that's showing real promise. He needs a strong woman to help him work it, and he's offering good money for the right girl. Sarah backed toward the window, her mind racing. How much money? Enough to save the farm and have some left over. Jeremiah wouldn't meet her eyes. $27 and a share in his mining claim. $27. That's what her father thought she was worth. Less than a good horse. Less than their old plow had been worth before they'd sold it. And if I say no? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Then we both starve come winter. Jeremiah finally looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just desperation. It was resignation. He'd already made up his mind. Sarah, you gotta understand. I'm doing this for both of us. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Sarah's time was running out faster than water through a broken dam. He's here, Jeremiah said, straightening his shirt and trying to smooth down his wild hair. Now you listen to me, girl. You'll be polite and respectful. You'll show him you're strong and capable, and you'll do whatever it takes to make this work. Sarah's hand found her mother's locket again. The metal was warm from her skin, and she could almost hear her mother's voice, whispering those words about worth and choice. But what choice did she have? Let her father lose everything, or sacrifice herself to save what little remained of their life? The hoofbeats stopped outside their door. Remember, Jeremiah hissed, our whole future depends on this. As footsteps approached their cabin, Sarah pressed herself against the window one last time, watching that hawk circle high above the prairie, free as the wind that carried it. The door exploded open without a knock, and the man who filled the doorway looked like he could wrestle bears for fun and win every time. Ezra Hutchins stood 6 feet tall and nearly as wide, with hands like ham hocks and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His clothes were expensive but dirty, and he smelled like horses, tobacco, and something else that made Sarah's nose wrinkle. When he smiled, she could see he was missing several teeth. Jeremiah! Hutchins boomed, stomping into their cabin like he owned it. Good to see you again, old friend. Sarah watched her father transform before her eyes, his desperate nervousness replaced by fake cheerfulness. Ezra, come in, come in. Can I offer you some coffee? Don't mind if I do. Hutchins pulled out a chair that groaned under his weight. His small, dark eyes found Sarah immediately, traveling up and down her body, like she was livestock at auction. And this must be the girl we discussed. Sarah May, Jeremiah said quickly. Sarah, come say hello to Mr. Hutchins. Sarah's feet felt glued to the floor. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. But where could she go? They were 20 miles from the nearest town, and she had no money, no horse, and no friends who could help her. She's shy, Hutchins said, still staring at Sarah. I like that in a woman. Too many of them got too much to say these days. Sarah's a good girl, Jeremiah assured him, pouring coffee with shaking hands. Hardworking, obedient, knows how to cook and clean. She'll make you a fine wife. Wife. The word made Sarah feel sick. This wasn't about marriage, it was about ownership. Hutchins wasn't looking for a partner. He was shopping for a servant he could also use for other purposes. Let me see her teeth, Hutchins said casually, like Sarah wasn't even in the room. Her teeth? Jeremiah looked confused. You check a horse's teeth before you buy it, don't you? Same principle. Hutchins gestured impatiently. Come here, girl. Open your mouth. Sarah's face burned with shame and anger. I'm not a horse. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Both men stared at her father with horror, Hutchins with amusement. Got some spirit, I see. Hutchins chuckled. That's all right. I can break spirit easy enough. Had plenty of practice with wild horses. Sarah, apologize this instant, Jeremiah hissed. But Sarah couldn't apologize. The words stuck in her throat like thorns. She was many things poor, desperate, trapped, but she wasn't an animal to be bought and sold. Now, Hutchins said, waving a meaty hand. No need for apologies. I actually prefer a woman with a little fire, makes breaking them more interesting." The casual cruelty in his voice made Sarah's blood freeze. This wasn't just about saving her father's farm anymore. This was about her survival. "Tell me about her work experience," Hutchins continued, settling back in his chair. "My claim is 60 miles north of here, up in the mountains. It's hard country, and I need someone who can handle difficult conditions." "She's been running this household since her mother died," Jeremiah said proudly. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, gardening. She's strong as an ox and twice as useful." Sarah wanted to scream. Her father was listing her abilities like items in a store catalog. 7 years of caring for him, of sacrificing her own dreams to keep their home running. And this was how he repaid Herbie, selling her to the highest bidder. "What about children?" Hutchins asked bluntly. "I need sons to help work the claim. She looks healthy enough to breed." The word breed made Sarah's vision blur with rage and fear. She wasn't cattle. She wasn't a broodmare. She was a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams that apparently meant nothing to anyone. "She's young and healthy," Jeremiah assured him. "Good wide hips, strong constitution. Her mother had 3 babies before Sarah, though we lost the others to fever." Sarah hadn't known about the other babies. Her father had never mentioned siblings who died before she was born. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, not just the knowledge of lost brothers or sisters, but the realization that her father had been planning this conversation for weeks, preparing answers to questions she'd never imagined anyone would ask about her. "Good bloodlines, then." Hutchins nodded approvingly. "What about education? I don't want some woman filling my son's heads with nonsense about books and such." "Oh, Sarah can't read much," Jeremiah lied smoothly. "Just enough to figure out recipes and such. Nothing fancy." Another lie. Sarah had taught herself to read, using her mother's old Bible and whatever book she could borrow from the traveling preacher. Reading was her escape, her secret pleasure, the one thing in her life that belonged entirely to her. But her father was willing to lie about even that to make the sale. "Perfect." Hutchins drained his coffee cup and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Now, let's talk price." Sarah watched in numb horror as the 2 men began negotiating her future like she was a piece of furniture. Hutchins offered $20. Her father countered with $35. They settled on $27, plus a half interest in Hutchins' mining claim, which might be worthless for all anyone knew. "Throw in the girl's personal belongings and we have a deal," Hutchins said, extending his massive hand. "Deal," Jeremiah agreed, shaking hands with enthusiasm that made Sarah want to vomit. "I'll take her with me today," Hutchins announced. "No point in waiting. I've got supplies to buy in town, and then we'll head north to the claim." Today, Sarah felt the world spinning around her. In a matter of hours, she would be leaving the only home she'd ever known to live with a stranger who spoke about her like property. "Sarah, go pack your things," Jeremiah ordered. "Don't take long. Mr. Hutchins is eager to get started." Sarah's legs finally moved, carrying her toward the corner where she kept her few possessions. Her mother's Bible, 2 dresses, a shawl, a brush, and little else. Everything that represented 19 years of life fit into a single small bag. As she packed, she could hear the men discussing practical matters, how long the journey would take, what supplies they'd need, when Hutchins would return with the money he'd promised. They spoke in cheerful, businesslike tones, as if they were discussing the weather instead of destroying her life. But as Sarah folded her mother's quilt, the one beautiful thing they still owned, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "Course, if the girl don't work out," Hutchins was saying quietly, "if she's too much trouble or can't handle the work, I might need to make other arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Jeremiah asked. "Well, there's always the mining camps further north. Plenty of men up there who'd pay good money for female company, if you know what I mean." The meaning hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. If she couldn't please Hutchins as a wife and worker, he'd sell her to a mining camp brothel. Her father's response was a low murmur she couldn't make out, but she didn't hear him objecting to the idea. Sarah's hands shook as she finished packing, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "You're worth more than anyone might try to pay for you." But apparently, she was worth exactly $27 and the promise of half a mining claim that might not even exist. As she picked up her bag and prepared to face her fate, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie once again. The sound of heavy boots on wooden steps made everyone in the cabin freeze like deer hearing a hunter's gun. Sheriff Thomas Kane pushed open the door without knocking, and his tall shadow fell across the room like a dark cloud covering the sun. His badge caught the morning light and flashed like a warning signal. "Well, well," Kane said, his voice deep and steady. "Looks like I got here just in time." Sarah's heart jumped in her chest. She had seen the sheriff around town before, but never up close like this. He was bigger than she remembered, with strong shoulders and hands that looked like they could break things or fix them, depending on what needed doing. His dark eyes moved around the room, taking in everything, her father's shaking hands, Mr. Hutchins sitting like a king on his throne, and Sarah herself standing by the window like a bird ready to fly away. "Morning, Sheriff," her father said, but his voice came out like a squeak from a rusty gate. "Just having a friendly chat with my neighbor here." Kane took off his hat and set it on the table next to the coins. His hair was dark brown with bits of gray, like winter was trying to creep in early. "Friendly chat, you say? That's interesting, because Mrs. Henderson from the general store told me she heard some concerning things about a business deal involving your daughter." Sarah felt her cheeks grow hot. People in town were talking about her like she was a cow being sold at market. The shame burned in her stomach, but something else burned there too. A tiny flame of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone cared about what happened to her. Mr. Hutchins leaned back in his chair and crossed his thick arms. "Don't see how this concerns the law, Sheriff. A man's got the right to arrange his daughter's future." "Arrange?" Kane's eyebrows went up like question marks. "That's a fancy way to say sell, don't you think?" The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Sarah's father went pale as milk, and Mr. Hutchins's face turned red as a summer sunset. But Kane just stood there, calm as still water, waiting for someone to answer. "Now, hold on just a minute," Hutchins said, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "I'm offering this girl a good home and a chance to be useful. Her father and I have come to a fair agreement." Kane looked at Sarah then, really looked at her, and she felt like he was seeing something nobody else had ever noticed before. "Miss Collins," he said, and his voice was gentle, like he was talking to a scared animal. "Have you agreed to this arrangement?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had never been asked what she wanted before. Her father made decisions. Her mother had made decisions when she was alive, and even Mrs. Henderson at the store told her which cloth to buy for dresses. But nobody had ever asked Sarah what Sarah wanted. "She's just shy," her father said quickly. "Girls don't always know what's best for them." "Is that so?" Kane's voice got quieter, which somehow made it scarier. "Well, I think grown women are smart enough to speak for themselves." He walked over to where Sarah stood by the window. Up close, she could smell leather and soap and something else, something clean and safe that made her think of Sunday mornings when her mother was still alive, and the world felt like it made sense. "Miss Collins," Kane said again, and this time he spoke just to her, like the two men weren't even in the room. "The law says you have the right to choose who you marry. You're 19 years old, which makes you old enough to decide for yourself." Sarah's heart was beating so fast she thought it might jump right out of her chest. Her mother's locket felt warm against her skin, like it was trying to give her courage. She looked at Kane's face and saw something she had never seen in a man's eyes before, kindness without wanting something back. She started, then stopped. Her father was staring at her with eyes full of worry and fear. Mr. Hutchins was glaring like she was a horse that wouldn't obey. But Kane just waited, patient as a mountain. "Take your time," Kane said softly. "This is your life we're talking about." Outside, the wind was picking up. and dark clouds were gathering in the sky like trouble was coming. Sarah could hear the old cabin creaking around them, and she thought about all the years she had spent in this place, cooking and cleaning and dreaming of somewhere else, anywhere else. "The law," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "What exactly does the law say about this?" Kane smiled then, and it changed his whole face. "The law says no woman can be forced into marriage against her will. The law says you have the right to say no." Mr. Hutchins made a sound like an angry bull. "This is ridiculous. I've already paid good money." "You haven't paid anything yet," Kane said without looking away from Sarah. "And you won't be paying anything unless the lady agrees." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years was finally opening. She looked at her father, who was wringing his hands like he was washing invisible dishes. She looked at Mr. Hutchins, who was red-faced and breathing hard. Then she looked back at Kane, who was waiting for her answer like it was the most important thing in the world. "I need to think," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah already knew what her answer would be. Thunder rolled across the prairie like God himself was bowling in heaven, and the first fat raindrops hit the window glass like tiny fists knocking for shelter. Sarah watched the storm clouds gather while her mind raced faster than wild horses. Behind her, the three men stood frozen like pieces on a chessboard, waiting for someone to make the next move. "Think about what?" Mr. Hutchins exploded, his voice loud enough to rattle the dishes on their shelf. "There's nothing to think about. Your father owes money, I need a wife, and you need a home. Simple as adding 2 plus 2. But Sheriff Kane held up his hand like he was stopping traffic. "Not so simple, Hutchins. The young lady has rights under territorial law, and I'm here to make sure those rights are respected." Sarah's father suddenly came alive like a puppet with new strings. "Rights?" he squeaked. "What about my rights? I've fed and clothed this girl for 19 years. I've got debts to pay, and winter coming fast." The words hit Sarah like cold water in the face. She spun around from the window, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. "So, that's all I am to you? A way to pay your debts?" For the first time since Sheriff Kane had walked through their door, her father looked right at her. His eyes were watery and sad, like a dog that knew it had done something wrong but didn't know what. "Sarah, honey, you don't understand how hard things have been. The drought killed our crops, the bank is breathing down my neck, and I don't have any other choices." "There are always choices," Kane said quietly. His voice was steady as bedrock, but Sarah could hear something else underneath, something that sounded like anger being held back by a strong fence. "The question is whether a man makes the right ones." Lightning flashed outside, bright enough to light up the whole cabin for just a second. In that flash, Sarah saw everything clearly. Her father's desperate face, Mr. Hutchins' greedy eyes, and Kane standing between them like a wall, protecting her from a flood. "Let me tell you what I see here," Kane continued, moving closer to where Hutchins stood. "I see a man trying to buy a human being like she's a piece of furniture. And I see another man willing to sell his own daughter to solve his problems." Hutchins's face went purple as a bruise. "You watch your mouth, Sheriff. I'm offering this girl more than she'll ever get anywhere else. A roof over her head, food on the table, and honest work to keep her busy." "Honest work?" Sarah found her voice again, and it came out stronger than she expected. "What kind of honest work?" Hutchins looked at her like she was a stupid child asking dumb questions. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, having babies to help with the mining operation when they get old enough. Women's work." The words fell into the room like stones dropping into deep water. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had imagined marriage before, dreamed about it sometimes when she was hanging laundry or kneading bread. But in her dreams, there had been love and kindness and someone who wanted to know what she thought about things. "And what if I don't want children right away?" she asked. "What if I want to learn to read better? Or maybe help in town with the school children?" Hutchins laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Read? What does a woman need with reading? That's just filling your head with foolish ideas that'll make you forget your place. Kane stepped forward then, and even though he didn't touch anyone, his presence filled the room like heat from a stove. Her place? That's right, Hutchins said, puffing out his chest like a rooster. A woman's place is taking care of her husband in his home, not filling her head with book learning and such nonsense. Sarah watched Kane's face change. It was like watching storm clouds gather, slow and careful but dangerous. His jaw got tight, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Mr. Hutchins," Kane said, his voice soft as silk, but sharp as a razor, "I think you and I have very different ideas about what a woman's place should be." The rain was coming harder now, drumming against the roof like 100 horses running. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and felt her mother's locket warm against her skin. She thought about her mother, who had been able to read and write and who used to tell Sarah stories about brave women who saved themselves instead of waiting for someone else to do it. "My mother could read," Sarah said suddenly. "She taught me letters before she died. She said knowledge was like having a lamp in a dark room. Once you had it, you could never really be lost again." Hutchins made a disgusted noise. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Girl's got her head full of romantic nonsense. I'll straighten that out quick enough." But Kane was looking at Sarah with something like wonder in his eyes. "Your mother was a wise woman. What else did she teach you?" Sarah felt her heart lift like a bird taking flight. Nobody had ever asked her about her mother's lessons before. "She taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by what someone else will pay for them. She said every person has something special inside them that can't be bought or sold." "Foolishness," Hutchins muttered. "Fill a woman's head with that kind of thinking, and she'll never be satisfied with her proper role." Kane turned to face Hutchins full on, and Sarah saw something in the sheriff's expression that made her stomach flutter. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind about something important. "You know what, Hutchins?" Kane said. "I don't think Miss Collins is going to be marrying you after all." The words dropped into the room like a bomb going off. Hutchins' mouth fell open, her father made a choking sound, and Sarah felt like the floor had just disappeared from under her feet. "What exactly are you saying, Sheriff?" Hutchins asked, his voice dangerous as a snake's hiss. Kane reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something that caught the light, a simple gold ring that looked old and precious and full of stories. "I'm saying," Kane replied, holding the ring where everyone could see it, "that if Miss Collins is willing, I'd like to offer her a different choice entirely." The coffee cup crashed to the floor, shattering like Sarah's world. Sheriff Kane had just spoken words that made no sense. Marriage, protection, choice. Her bare feet stepped back from the broken pieces, and she felt like she might break too. "What are you saying?" Sarah whispered. Her voice shook like leaves in winter wind. Kane kept his eyes on Hutchins, but his words were for her. "I'm saying you don't have to go with him. There's another way to stay safe." Hutchins laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You think you can just take what's mine, Sheriff?" "She's not yours," Kane said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the whole room. "She's not anyone's." Sarah's father slammed his fist on the table. The coins jumped and scattered. "I need that money. The bank man comes tomorrow." "Papa," Sarah said, and her heart felt heavy as stones. "You would really sell me?" Jeremiah's face went red. "It's not selling. It's marriage. It's what girls do." "Not like this," Kane said. He turned to look at Sarah, and his eyes were kind. "Miss Collins, you're old enough to choose for yourself. The law says so." Sarah touched her mother's locket. She remembered her mama's soft voice. "Little star, you're worth more than gold." But what if her papa lost their home? What if they had nowhere to go? "I don't understand," Sarah said. "What kind of marriage?" Kane's cheeks turned pink. "A real one, to keep you safe from men like him." He nodded toward Hutchins. "But only if you want it." Hutchins stood up fast. His chair fell over with a bang. "This is crazy talk. We had a deal." "We had no deal," Sarah said. The words came out before she could stop them. "Nobody asked me what I wanted." "You're just a girl," Hutchins yelled. Girls don't get to want things. Sarah felt something hot rise up in her chest. It felt like fire, but good fire. The kind that keeps you warm, not the kind that burns you up. I'm 19 years old, she said, standing taller. I can read and write and think for myself. Her father looked shocked. Sarah May, mind your tongue. But Kane smiled. Just a little, but Sarah saw it. She's right, he said. She can think for herself. Outside, the wind started blowing harder. Sarah could hear it whistling around the cabin. Storm clouds were getting darker, like someone was pulling a blanket over the sun. This is taking too long, Hutchins said. He put his hand on his belt, where his knife hung. I paid good money to come here. You haven't paid anything yet, Kane said. His hand moved to his gun, but he didn't pull it out. And you won't. Sarah felt scared and brave at the same time. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a bird trying to fly out of her chest. She looked at Kane's face. It was strong and honest. She looked at Hutchins. His eyes were mean and cold. If I marry you, she said to Kane, what happens then? Then you come live in town with me, Kane said. You'll be safe. You can learn things, do things. You'll have choices. And if I go with him? She nodded toward Hutchins. Kane's jaw got tight. Then I can't help you anymore. Sarah closed her eyes. She thought about her mama, who died when Sarah was 12. She thought about all the nights she dreamed of leaving this place. She thought about the books she wanted to read and the places she wanted to see. When she opened her eyes, Hutchins was staring at her like she was a horse he wanted to buy. I have a question, Sarah said. Her voice was stronger now. Mr. Hutchins, why do you want a wife? Hutchins looked surprised. To cook and clean and have babies. Why else? And after I have babies, what then? Then you have more babies. Sarah felt sick. She looked at Kane. Why do you want a wife? Kane thought for a moment. I want someone to talk to, someone to share life with, someone who makes her own choices. Even if I say no to things you want? Even then. Sarah felt the weight of her choice like a heavy coat. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like God was moving furniture around. The first drops of rain hit the window. Her father was counting his coins again, his hands shaking. He looked old and scared. Sarah felt sorry for him, but not sorry enough to give up her life. Sheriff Kane, she said, and her voice didn't shake anymore. I accept your offer. The words hung in the air like smoke. Hutchins's face went dark as the storm clouds. Her father stopped counting coins. Kane let out a breath he'd been holding. You sure? Kane asked. I'm sure. And just as Sarah spoke those words, lightning split the sky outside, and Hutchins reached for his knife. Act 6. The knife came out fast, but Kane was faster. He grabbed Hutchins's wrist before the blade could move. The two men crashed into the table, sending coins flying everywhere. Sarah jumped back against the wall, her heart pounding like hammers. You're making a big mistake, Sheriff, Hutchins yelled. He was bigger than Kane, but Kane was quicker. Kane twisted Hutchins's arm behind his back. The knife fell to the floor with a clang. The only mistake here is you thinking you can pull a weapon on a peace officer. Rain started hitting the roof like tiny rocks. The storm was here. Sarah's father scrambled around on his hands and knees, trying to collect his scattered coins. My money! Help me find my money! But Sarah was watching Kane hold Hutchins. The sheriff wasn't even breathing hard. Hutchins was red in the face and mad as a wet cat. Let me go, Hutchins demanded. Can't do that, Kane said calmly. You just committed assault with a deadly weapon. Thunder crashed overhead so loud it shook the cabin. Sarah had never heard thunder that loud before. It sounded like the world was breaking apart. Sarah, her father called. Stop standing there and help me. But Sarah didn't move. She was thinking about something Kane had said, something about her making her own choices. Well, this was a choice too. No, Papa, she said. Her father looked up from the floor, a coin in each hand. What did you say? I said no. Sarah's voice was steady, even though inside she felt like the storm. I'm not going to help you collect money for selling me. Jeremiah's face went white. Sarah May Collins, you will do as I say. No, Sarah said again. I won't. Kane smiled while he held on to Hutchins. I think your daughter has found her voice, Jeremiah. Lightning flashed outside, bright as daylight, for just a second. In that flash, Sarah saw something that made her gasp. Through the window, she could see more men coming toward the cabin. 3 of them riding horses through the rain. Sheriff, she said urgently, look outside. Kane's head turned. When he saw the riders, his face got serious. Friends of yours, Hutchins? Hutchins grinned, even with his arm twisted behind his back. I brought some help, in case you gave me trouble. Sarah, Kane said, his voice calm but firm, there's a rifle behind the door. Can you reach it? Sarah's hands shook as she grabbed the long gun. It was heavier than she expected. She'd never held a rifle before, but she'd watched her father clean his hunting gun many times. I don't know how to use this, she whispered. You won't have to, Kane said. Just hold it and look like you do. The 3 men rode up to the cabin and stopped. Their horses stamped and snorted in the rain. One of them called out, Hutchins, you in there? In here, Hutchins yelled back. The sheriff's got me, but not for long. Kane sighed. This just got more complicated. Sarah felt scared, but also something else. She felt angry. These men had come to take her away like she was a sack of flour. They thought they could just ride up and grab her. How many bullets are in this rifle? She asked. Kane looked surprised. 6. Why? Just wondering. The front door crashed open. The 3 men stood there, dripping rain water and looking mean. They all had guns. Let him go, Sheriff, the biggest one said. We don't want trouble with the law, but we'll make some if we have to. Sarah stepped forward holding the rifle. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. And we don't want trouble with you, but we'll give you some if you force us to. All 3 men stared at her. They probably expected her to hide behind Kane, not stand beside him with a weapon. Little girl, the big man said, you better put that gun down before you hurt yourself. I'm not little, Sarah said, and I'm not your girl. Kane was still holding Hutchins, but Sarah could see he was proud of her. His eyes were shining, even in the dim cabin light. Your move? Kane said to the 3 men. But I should tell you, assaulting a peace officer is a hanging offense in this territory. Thunder rolled again, softer this time. The worst of the storm was moving past them, but Sarah felt like her own storm was just beginning. For the first time in her life, she was fighting for herself. One of the men took a step forward. That's when Sarah surprised everyone, including herself. She pointed the rifle right at him and said in a voice clear as a bell, That's far enough. And in that moment, standing in her father's broken cabin with rain drumming on the roof and her mother's locket warm against her heart, Sarah Collins knew she would never be the same frightened girl again. The question now was, would these men be smart enough to walk away? The sound of metal hitting wood made everyone in the cabin freeze, like deer hearing a hunter's footstep. Kane reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something that caught the dim light streaming through the rain-streaked window. Sarah's breath stopped in her throat when she saw what lay in his weathered palm. It was a simple gold ring, worn smooth by years of loving hands. Not fancy like the jewelry she'd seen rich ladies wear in town, but solid and real as the mountains that surrounded their valley. The band was thin but strong, with tiny flowers carved around its edge, so small you had to look close to see them. This belonged to my grandmother, Mary Kane, the sheriff said, his voice gentle as morning mist. She wore it for 62 years, through good times and bad. Before she died, she made me promise something important. Hutchins shifted in his chair like a snake getting ready to strike. His face had turned red as a sunset, and his thick fingers kept opening and closing into fists. You can't be serious, Kane. That girl's already been promised to me. Promised by who? Kane asked, not taking his eyes off Sarah. Did anyone ask what she wanted? Sarah felt her heart beating so hard she wondered if everyone could hear it. The ring seemed to glow in Kane's palm like a tiny sun. She thought about her mother's stories of women who got to choose their own lives, and how those stories always seemed like fairy tales until this moment. "What did your grandmother make you promise?" Sarah asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Kane smiled, and it changed his whole face. "She said to give this ring only to a woman brave enough to choose her own path. Someone who wouldn't let others decide her worth." He paused, watching Sarah's face carefully. "She said I'd know her when I met her." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like God himself was moving furniture in heaven. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof with fingers that never got tired. Lightning flashed, turning the whole world white for just a second before darkness came back. Jeremiah Collins looked like he was going to be sick. "Sarah, think about what you're doing. That money from Mr. Hutchins could save our farm. Without it, we'll lose everything we've worked for." "Everything you've worked for," Sarah said quietly. "I never got to choose what I worked for." Hutchins stood up so fast his chair fell backward with a crash. "I've traveled 2 days to get here, and I'm not leaving empty-handed. We had a deal, Collins." "The deal's off," Kane said, stepping between Hutchins and Sarah. "A person can't be sold like a horse or a cow. That's the law." "Your law," Hutchins snarled. "Out here, a man's word is his bond, and Collins gave me his word." "I gave my word about my property," Jeremiah said, his voice shaking. "And a father has the right to decide what's best for his daughter." "Does he?" Kane turned to look at Sarah again. "Miss Collins, you're 19 years old. Old enough to vote if you were a man. Old enough to own land, start a business, or make any choice about your life. Old enough to decide who you marry." Sarah felt something stirring inside her chest, like a bird that had been caged for so long it almost forgot how to fly. She looked at her father, then at Hutchins with his mean eyes and grabbing hands, then back at the sheriff who was offering her something she'd never had before. "Choice. If I took that ring," she said slowly, "what would it mean?" "It would mean you're under my protection as my wife," Kane said. "Common law marriage is legal in Wyoming territory. But more than that, it would mean you get to decide what happens next in your life." The room went so quiet, Sarah could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, counting off seconds like a heart beating. She thought about all the mornings she'd watched through this same window, dreaming of a different life. All the nights she'd lain awake wondering if this cabin would be her whole world forever. Hutchins pulled out a knife from his belt, the blade catching the light like a mean smile. "I paid good money for that girl, and I'm taking what's mine." But Sarah was already moving. She stepped forward and held out her left hand to Kane. "I choose you," she said, her voice ringing clear as a church bell. "I choose my own life." Kane slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been waiting for her all along. The moment the gold touched her skin, something changed in the air of the cabin. Sarah felt taller, stronger, like she was finally the right size for her own life. "Now you've done it," Hutchins said, raising his knife. "That girl belongs to me, and I'm taking her whether she likes it or not." But Kane was faster than lightning in a bottle. He grabbed Hutchins's wrist and twisted until the knife clattered to the floor. The big man dropped to his knees with a howl that mixed with the thunder outside. "That's assault on a peace officer," Kane said calmly. "I'd say that's worth 30 days in jail." Sarah looked down at the ring on her finger. It was warm from Kane's touch and caught the lamplight like a promise. For the first time in her life, she belonged to herself. The wedding took place 3 hours later in Judge Morrison's office above the general store, while rain still tapped against the windows like guests trying to get in. Sarah wore her mother's blue dress, the only nice thing she owned, and carried a small bunch of wildflowers Kane had picked from behind the jail. Judge Morrison was a round man with kind eyes and a beard that looked like a gray cloud had settled on his chin. He'd married dozens of couples over the years, but something about this wedding felt different. Maybe it was the way the bride kept touching her ring like she couldn't believe it was real, or how the groom stood protective but not possessive beside her. "Do we have witnesses?" the judge asked, looking around the small office. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store downstairs, had come up when she heard about the wedding. She was a tiny woman with sharp eyes who seemed to know everything that happened in town before it happened. "I'll witness," she said, smoothing down her apron. "Though I have to say, this is the most excitement we've had since the bank got robbed last spring." Doc Harrison had also wandered in, drawn by curiosity and the free coffee Mrs. Peterson always made for special occasions. He was an old man who delivered half the babies in the territory and patched up the other half when they got into fights. "Count me in too," he said. "I like a good love story." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "It's not exactly a love story," she started to say, but Kane squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe not yet," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "But it could be." Judge Morrison opened his big leather book and cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join Thomas Michael Kane and Sarah Mae Collins in holy matrimony." Sarah's heart was beating like a drum in her chest. She kept thinking about how different this morning had been, when she was just a girl trapped in her father's cabin with no choices and no hope. Now she was standing in a judge's office about to become someone's wife, but not the way she'd always feared. This felt like stepping through a door into a bigger world, instead of being pushed into a smaller cage. "Thomas," the judge continued, "do you take Sarah to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Kane turned to face Sarah fully, and she saw something in his brown eyes that made her breath catch. It wasn't the hungry look Hutchins had given her, or the tired disappointment she always saw in her father's face. It was respect, pure and simple. "I do," Kane said, and his voice was steady as bedrock. "And Sarah," Judge Morrison said, "do you take Thomas to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Sarah thought about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 12, but who had always told her that a woman's worth wasn't measured by who wanted to marry her, but by the size of her own heart and the strength of her own spirit. She thought about all the women who had come before her, who had made the best choices they could with the options they had. "I do," she said, and the words felt like the truest thing she'd ever spoken. Judge Morrison smiled. "By the power vested in me by the Wyoming territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." Kane leaned down and kissed Sarah gently, respectfully, like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. It was her first real kiss, and it tasted like freedom and possibility and the promise of better days ahead. Mrs. Peterson clapped her hands together. "Oh, that was lovely. Sarah, dear, you make a beautiful bride." Doc Harrison pulled out a small flask from his coat pocket. "This calls for a celebration," he said, offering it around. "Best whiskey in the territory." Sarah shook her head politely, but Kane took a small sip and passed it to Judge Morrison. The rain outside was finally stopping, and late afternoon sunlight was starting to break through the clouds, sending golden beams through the office windows. "There's something else," Kane said, reaching into his coat pocket again. "Every bride deserves a proper wedding gift." He pulled out a small leather-bound book with gold lettering on the cover. Sarah's eyes went wide when she read the title, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. "You can read?" Kane asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. "Yes," Sarah whispered, taking the book like it was made of gold and diamonds. "My mother taught me before she died, but Father said it was a waste of time for a woman." "My first wife was a teacher," Kane said. "She left behind a whole library of books. She always said that knowledge was the greatest gift one person could give another." Sarah felt tears starting in her eyes, but they were happy tears. In one day, she'd gone from being sold like cattle to being married to a man who thought her mind was worth as much as her work. She'd gone from having no choices to having a husband who gave her books and treated her like an equal. "Mrs. Kane," Judge Morrison said, and Sarah realized he was talking to her. Welcome to the family of married folks. May you find joy in your new life. Mrs. Kane. Sarah May Kane. The name felt like putting on clothes that actually fit after wearing things too small for years. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky pink and gold and purple. Sarah stood at the window of her new life, holding her husband's hand and her first wedding gift, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't imagine yet. But for the first time in her 19 years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was excited to see what it would bring. "Sarah Kane, you don't belong here." The angry voice cut through the morning air like a sharp knife. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman stood blocking the entrance to the general store, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Behind her, 3 other women from town nodded their heads in agreement. Sarah had been married to Sheriff Kane for exactly 2 weeks now. She'd walked into town that Tuesday morning hoping to buy flour and sugar. Instead, she found herself facing the meanest group of women in all of Wyoming territory. "I have money to spend, same as anyone," Sarah said quietly. She kept her voice calm, but her heart was beating fast like a rabbit running from a wolf. "Money that came from tricking our sheriff into marriage," Mrs. Whitman shot back. Her face was red with anger. "Everyone knows what you really are. Your father tried to sell you like a cow at market." The words hit Sarah like stones thrown at her chest. She felt her cheeks burn hot with shame. Other people on the street had stopped walking. They stood watching the scene, like it was some kind of show put on just for them. Sarah's fingers found her mother's silver locket hanging around her neck. She thought about all the books she'd been reading in Kane's house. Books about brave women who stood up for themselves. Books about people who chose to be better than what others expected. "What I am," Sarah said, lifting her chin higher, "is Mrs. Thomas Kane, and I'm not going anywhere." Mrs. Whitman stepped closer. "We'll see about that. This town has ways of dealing with women who don't know their place." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire. Sarah realized this wasn't just about buying supplies. This was about whether she'd have any friends in this town, whether she'd be welcome anywhere except in her own house. That afternoon, Sarah sat alone in Kane's kitchen. The big house felt empty without him. He'd ridden out that morning to check on some trouble with cattle thieves near the North Ridge. He wouldn't be back until tomorrow night. She'd managed to buy her flour and sugar, but only after old Mr. Peterson had stepped in and told the women to move aside. Still, their words kept ringing in her ears like church bells that wouldn't stop. The sound of horses outside made her look up from her book. Through the window, she saw 4 men she didn't recognize tying their horses to the fence. They wore dirty clothes and had guns on their hips. Something about the way they moved made her stomach feel tight with worry. A loud knock came at her door, then another, then a third that sounded more like someone hitting the wood with their fist. "I'm sorry to interrupt you right here, but if you're enjoying this story thus far, please consider to subscribe to our channel so that you can enjoy so many more in the future. And by the way, don't hesitate to like the video as well, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now enjoy the rest of the story." "Mrs. Kane," a rough voice called out. "We know you're in there. We need to talk." Sarah set down her book and walked quietly to the window. She peeked out through the curtain. The men stood on her front porch now. One of them had a scar running down his left cheek. Another kept spitting brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "Your husband arrested our friend last week," the scarred man continued. "We think maybe you can help us work out a deal." Sarah's mouth went dry. She knew exactly who they meant. Kane had arrested a man named Jake Morrison for stealing horses. Morrison was sitting in the town jail right now, waiting for the judge to arrive next month. "Sheriff ain't here," she called back through the door. "You'll have to come back later." "Oh, we know he ain't here," the man laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. "That's exactly why we came today." Sarah's hands began to shake. She looked around the house for something to protect herself with. Kane's rifle hung above the fireplace, but she'd never shot a gun in her life. There was a big knife in the kitchen, but that meant getting close to whoever wanted to hurt her. "We're coming in now, lady." another voice said. "Make this easy on yourself." The front door handle started to turn. Sarah realized with cold fear that she'd forgotten to lock it after coming home from town. In the cabin where she grew up, they never had anything worth stealing. But this house was different. This life was different. The door began to open slowly. Sarah grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace. Her hands shook so hard she could barely hold it steady. She'd watched Kane clean it many times, but she wasn't sure if it was even loaded. Now, the scarred man said as he stepped inside. "No need for that. We just want to have a friendly conversation." "Get out of my house," Sarah said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "Your house?" the man grinned, showing teeth that were brown and broken. "Funny thing about that. Word around town is this marriage of yours isn't exactly the real thing. More like a business deal to keep you out of trouble." Sarah felt her face go hot again. Even these criminals had heard the gossip about her marriage. It seemed like everyone in the territory had an opinion about her life. "What do you want?" she asked. "Simple," the man said. "You write a note to your husband. Tell him if he wants to see his pretty wife again, he'll let Jake Morrison go free. Then you come with us for a little ride until the deal is done." Sarah's mind raced. If she went with these men, she might never come back. But if she refused, they might hurt her right here in her own kitchen. Either way, Kane would blame himself for leaving her alone. She thought about the women in town who'd called her names that morning. They'd probably say she got what she deserved. They'd probably say Kane was better off without her. But then she remembered something. Kane had given her a choice. He'd asked her what she wanted, not what was best for everyone else. He'd treated her like her opinion mattered. Maybe it was time to show him that his trust hadn't been wasted. "I'll write your note," Sarah said slowly. "But first, you have to promise not to hurt anyone in town. This is between you and the sheriff." The scarred man's grin got wider. "Look at that, boys. The little lady thinks she can make deals with us." "I'm serious," Sarah said. She tried to make her voice sound stronger than she felt. "Promise me, or I won't help you at all." The men looked at each other. Finally, the leader shrugged. "Fine. No one gets hurt if your husband cooperates. Now put down that rifle and write the note." Sarah set the gun aside and walked to Kane's desk. She picked up his pen and a piece of paper. As she wrote, her mind was working on a different plan. These men thought she was just a scared girl who'd do whatever they told her. They were about to find out how wrong they could be. The abandoned mineshaft sat 3 miles north of town, hidden behind a wall of red rocks that looked like giant teeth against the evening sky. Sarah had been tied to a wooden post inside the old mining building for almost 6 hours now. Her wrists hurt from the rough rope, and her mouth felt dry as desert sand. But her mind was sharp and clear. The 4 men sat around a small fire, drinking whiskey and playing cards. They kept looking toward the entrance, waiting for Sheriff Kane to arrive with their friend Jake Morrison. What they didn't know was that Sarah had written 2 messages that afternoon. The first message was the one they'd watched her write. It told Kane to bring Morrison to the mine and trade him for her safety. But while pretending to seal that letter, Sarah had quickly written a second note. She'd slipped it into her boot before the men could see. When they'd forced her onto a horse for the ride to the mine, she'd managed to drop that second note right outside her front door. She could only hope Kane would find it when he came home. "Should have been here by now," the scarred man muttered. He kept checking his pocket watch, like looking at it would make time move faster. "Maybe the sheriff don't care as much about his wife as we thought," said another man. This one had a beard that hung down to his chest like tangled black rope. Sarah felt a stab of worry. What if Kane really didn't come? What if he decided she wasn't worth the risk? After all, their marriage had started as just a way to protect her from Hutchins. Kane had never promised to love her or risk his life for her. But then she heard something that made her heart jump with hope. Horses, moving fast, coming up the rocky path toward the mine. "That'll be him," the leader said. He stood up and checked his gun. "Remember, boys, nice and easy. We get Morrison, they get the girl, everyone goes home happy." Through the open door of the mining building, Sarah could see a figure on horseback in the fading light. The rider wore a badge that caught the last rays of sunlight, but something seemed wrong. Kane sat too still in his saddle, and he was alone. "Where's Morrison?" the scarred man called out. "Safe," Kane's voice came back. "Where's my wife?" "She's right here," the man replied. "But before we make any trades, you need to understand something. We've got friends all over this territory. If anything happens to us tonight, your pretty little wife won't live to see morning." Sarah watched Kane climb down from his horse. Even from a distance, she could see the careful way he moved, like a cat getting ready to pounce, like a man with a plan. "Let me see her," Kane said. The leader grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the doorway. The rope around her wrists made it hard to keep her balance, but she managed to stay on her feet. "There she is," the man said. "Safe and sound, just like we promised." Kane's eyes met Sarah's across the space between them. In that moment, she saw something that made her heart sing like birds in springtime. He wasn't looking at her like she was a burden he had to rescue. He was looking at her like she was the most important thing in his whole world. "Now," the scarred man continued, "you bring Morrison out here, and we'll—" His words were cut off by the sound of horses coming from 3 different directions at once. Suddenly, the area around the mine was full of men with badges and guns. Deputy Williams appeared from behind one rock formation. Marshal Tucker rode in from another direction. Even old Mr. Peterson from the general store was there, carrying a shotgun that looked almost as old as he was. "What the bearded man started to say. "Drop your weapons," Kane commanded. His voice carried the kind of authority that made even dangerous men think twice about fighting. Sarah felt a huge smile spread across her face. Her second note had worked perfectly. She'd told Kane about the mine, but she'd also suggested he bring help. Lots of help. The 4 criminals looked around at all the guns pointed in their direction. Slowly, they set their weapons on the ground. "How did you?" the leader began. "My wife's smarter than you gave her credit for," Kane said. There was pride in his voice that made Sarah's chest feel warm. "She left me instructions." As the deputies tied up the criminals, Kane walked over to where Sarah stood. He cut the ropes around her wrists with his knife, then gently rubbed her sore hands to help the feeling come back. "You took a big risk," he said quietly. "Writing that second note could have gotten you killed if they'd caught you." "I had to try," Sarah replied. "I couldn't just sit there and do nothing." Kane looked into her eyes for a long moment. "Sarah, when I found that note and realized what had happened, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." "What was that?" "Fear," he admitted. "Real, honest fear of losing someone who matters to me." Sarah felt her heart start beating faster, but this time it wasn't from danger. "Thomas, our marriage started as just protection, but it doesn't have to stay that way," he finished. "Not if you don't want it to." The evening stars were starting to appear in the darkening sky above them. Around them, the deputies were loading the criminals onto horses for the ride back to town. But Sarah only had eyes for the man standing in front of her. "When I was tied up in there," she said, "I kept thinking about something. All my life, people have told me what I was worth. My father said I was worth $27 and a mining claim. Hutchins said I was worth whatever he felt like paying. The women in town today said I wasn't worth anything at all." Kane waited for her to continue. "But when you looked at me just now," Sarah went on, "I finally understood what my mother used to tell me. She said my worth wasn't something other people could decide. It was something I had to claim for myself." "And what do you think you're worth?" Kane asked softly. Sarah smiled. "I think I'm worth choosing my own happiness. And I choose you, Thomas Kane. Not because I need protection, but because I want to build a real life with a good man." Kane's answer was to kiss her, gentle and sweet, under the wide Wyoming sky. When they broke apart, Sarah could see her future stretching out before her, like the endless prairie. It would have challenges and storms, just like any life, But it would be her life, chosen freely and lived on her own terms. "Come on, Mrs. Kane," Thomas said, offering her his arm. "Let's go home." As they walked toward their horses, Sarah touched her mother's locket one more time. She whispered a quiet thank you to all the women who had come before her, women who had dreamed of the kind of choice she'd been given. Then she climbed onto her horse and rode toward town beside the man who had shown her that love, real love, wasn't about being bought or sold. It was about two people choosing each other day after day and building something beautiful together. Behind them, the old mine disappeared into darkness. But ahead, the lights of home glowed warm and welcoming, promising tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. The scream split the morning air like a knife through silk. Sarah dropped the coffee pot and ran toward the sound, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. Through the kitchen window, she could see smoke rising from the direction of town, thick, black smoke that meant trouble. Thomas burst through the front door, his face grim as storm clouds. "Bank's been robbed," he said, strapping on his gun belt. "3 men with masks. They took everything and shot Mr. Peterson when he tried to stop them." Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. Old Mr. Peterson ran the general store and had been kind to her since she'd arrived in town. He'd never hurt anyone in his whole life. "Is he?" "Doc Miller's with him now. But Sarah, there's something else." Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "One of the robbers, Mrs. Henderson says she recognized his voice. It was your father." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her legs went weak, and she had to grab the back of a chair to keep from falling. All these weeks of building a new life, and now her past was crashing back like a wild horse with its tail on fire. "That can't be right," she whispered. "Papa wouldn't this not." But even as she spoke, Sarah remembered the desperate look in her father's eyes that last morning, the way his hands had shaken when he counted those pitiful coins. How far would a desperate man go when he had nothing left to lose? Thomas crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took her hands in his. "I have to go after them. The trail's still fresh, and if we wait too long, they'll disappear into the mountains where we'll never find them." Sarah looked into her husband's eyes and saw the conflict there. He was torn between his duty as sheriff and his desire to protect her from this awful truth. But Sarah had learned something important in the past few weeks. Running from hard truths only made them bigger and scarier. "I'm coming with you," she said. "Absolutely not." Thomas shook his head firmly. "It's too dangerous, and besides—" "Besides what? I'm just a woman who should stay home and worry." Sarah pulled her hands free and stood straighter. "Thomas Kane, that's my father out there. If anyone can talk sense into him, it's me." For a moment, Thomas looked like he might argue. Then he saw the set of Sarah's jaw, the fire in her storm-gray eyes, and he remembered why he'd fallen in love with this woman in the first place. She wasn't the type to hide while others fought her battles. "Can you ride?" he asked. Sarah smiled for the first time that morning. "Papa might not have taught me much, but he did teach me to sit a horse." 20 minutes later, they were riding hard across the prairie with Deputy Martinez and 2 other men from town. The morning sun was climbing higher, but the air still held the bite of autumn cold. Sarah rode Thomas's spare horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, and tried not to think about what they might find at the end of this chase. The trail led north toward the rocky hills, where outlaws liked to hide. Sarah knew these lands from childhood, every creek and canyon, every place a desperate man might think to make a stand. As they rode, pieces of a terrible puzzle began fitting together in her mind. 3 weeks ago, a stranger had come through town asking questions about the bank schedules. Sarah had seen him talking to someone behind Murphy's saloon, but she hadn't been able to see who. Now she wondered if that someone had been her father. "There," Deputy Martinez called out, pointing toward a narrow canyon ahead. "Fresh horse tracks leading up that way." Thomas raised his hand to signal a halt. The canyon was the perfect place for an ambush, high walls on both sides, and only one way in or out. Sarah studied the rocky slopes and felt her stomach tighten with worry. "Martinez, you and Johnson circle around to the back of the canyon," Thomas ordered. "Sarah and I will go up the main trail. Collins, you stay here and watch the horses." "Wait," Sarah said suddenly. Something had been nagging at her since they'd started this chase, and now it finally clicked into place. "The money from the bank due, we know how much they took?" "About $200, Thomas replied. "Why?" Sarah's face went pale. "Papa owed Mr. Hutchins $27. The bank was going to take our farm for 60 more. That's not even half of what they stole." The men looked at each other with growing understanding. If Jeremiah Collins had only needed less than $100 to solve his problems, why would he risk everything to steal twice that amount? Unless he wasn't the one planning this robbery, Thomas said grimly. Unless someone else was using his desperation to get him to do their dirty work. A new kind of fear crept up Sarah's spine. If her father was just a pawn in someone else's game, then he was in even more danger than they'd thought. Desperate men could sometimes be reasoned with. But cold, calculating criminals were a different story entirely. The sound of gunshots echoed from the canyon ahead, sharp cracks that bounced off the rock walls like deadly thunder. Thomas spurred his horse forward, and Sarah followed, her heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves. Whatever was waiting for them in that canyon, Sarah knew their lives were about to change again. But this time, she wasn't the frightened girl being sold like cattle. This time, she was riding into danger by choice, ready to fight for the people she loved. The canyon walls rose around them like the jaws of some enormous beast, and Sarah gripped her reins tighter, preparing for whatever came next. The canyon opened into a small clearing, where 3 men crouched behind fallen logs, their stolen money scattered on the ground like autumn leaves. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she recognized the familiar slope of her father's shoulders, the way he held his head when he was scared. But it was the man standing over him with a gun that made her blood run cold. Ezra Hutchins turned at the sound of approaching horses, his thick lips pulled back in a smile that showed too many teeth. "Well, well, Sheriff Kane and his pretty little wife. Right on time." "Let them go, Hutchins," Thomas called out, his hand resting on his gun. "This is between you and me." Hutchins laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a well. "Oh, but you're wrong about that, Sheriff. This is about so much more than just money." He grabbed Jeremiah by the shirt and hauled him to his feet. "Tell your daughter what you really did, old man." Jeremiah's face was the color of old newspaper, and his eyes wouldn't meet Sarah's. "I'm sorry, girl. I'm so sorry. But he said he'd burn down the whole town if I didn't help him." Sarah felt like someone had punched all the air out of her lungs. "Papa, what are you talking about?" "The bank robbery was never about the money," Hutchins said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "It was about getting you here, Mrs. Kane. You see, your husband cost me something valuable when he interfered with our little business arrangement. Now I aim to collect what's owed." Thomas stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "You're talking about kidnapping a citizen of this territory. That's a hanging offense." "Only if someone lives to tell about it," Hutchins replied. What happened next seemed to unfold like a bad dream. Hutchins raised his gun toward Thomas, but Sarah was already moving. She'd learned to read danger in men's eyes during those terrible weeks before her wedding, and she saw murder written clearly in Hutchins's face. "Papa, get down!" she screamed, spurring her horse forward. The clearing exploded into chaos. Thomas dove to one side as Hutchins fired, the bullet whining past his ear like an angry bee. Deputy Martinez and his men appeared at the far end of the clearing, their guns drawn. But it was Sarah who changed everything. Instead of running away from the danger like everyone expected, she rode straight at Hutchins. Her horse, startled by the gunfire, reared up on its hind legs just as Hutchins tried to grab Sarah from the saddle. The horse's hooves caught him square in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into the dirt. Sarah tumbled from her horse and landed hard, scraping her hands on the rocky ground. But she was up in an instant, her mother's locket swinging wildly as she helped her father to his feet. "Are you hurt?" she asked, checking him over for injuries. Jeremiah shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Why did you come for me? After everything I did trying to sell you, getting mixed up with that snake, why would you risk yourself?" Sarah looked at her father, this broken man who'd lost his way when grief and desperation clouded his judgment. She thought about all the anger she'd carried, all the hurt and fear from that terrible morning when he tried to trade her like livestock. But she also remembered the man who'd taught her to ride, who'd told her stories by the fire when she was small, who'd cried the night her mother died and promised to take care of their little girl forever. "Because you're my papa," she said simply. "And family doesn't give up on family, even when they make terrible mistakes." Thomas appeared at her side, breathing hard but unhurt. Behind him, Deputy Martinez was putting handcuffs on Hutchins, who was conscious but wheezing from where the horse had knocked the wind out of him. "The other 2 men got away," Martinez reported. "But we recovered most of the money." Thomas nodded, then turned to Jeremiah. "Mr. Collins, you're under arrest for bank robbery. But given the circumstances, the threats against your family and the town, I suspect the judge might be inclined toward mercy." Jeremiah straightened his shoulders, and for the first time in months, he looked like the man Sarah remembered from her childhood. "I'll take whatever punishment comes, Sheriff. I've done wrong, and I need to make it right." As they prepared to ride back to town, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange twists her life had taken. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a frightened girl with no choices. Now she was a woman who'd ridden into danger to save her father, married to a man who respected her courage, and part of a community that would accept her family's mistakes without defining them by those failures. The sun was setting as they reached the outskirts of town, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sarah rode beside her husband, her father safe if not entirely free, and felt something she'd never experienced before: the deep satisfaction of knowing she'd fought for what mattered and won. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing over the simple gold band that had started as protection and become so much more. "Mrs. Kane," he said softly, "remind me never to get on your bad side." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie like music. "Just remember that the next time you think about leaving me behind, Sheriff." As they rode toward home, where lamplight glowed warm in windows and families gathered around dinner tables, Sarah knew that some stories didn't end, they just began new chapters. And she was ready to write whatever came next. The church bell's bronze voice rang across the town square, calling families to the Sunday social that would test every lesson Sarah had learned about standing tall. 3 weeks had passed since her marriage to Thomas, and today marked her first appearance at a community gathering where the women would either welcome her or turn their backs like a flock of judgmental sparrows. Sarah smoothed her blue dress, Thomas's late wife's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and tried to calm the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Through the window of their house, she could see families walking toward the church, children skipping ahead, while mothers carried covered dishes that smelled of cinnamon and hope. "You don't have to do this today," Thomas said from behind her, his voice gentle as morning rain. He stood in the doorway, tall and steady, holding his hat in hands that had once placed a ring on her finger and changed her world forever. "Yes, I do," Sarah replied, turning to face him with determination blazing in her storm-gray eyes. "I can't hide in this house forever, no matter how many wonderful books it holds." The walk to the church felt longer than the distance from earth to stars. With each step, Sarah noticed how conversations stopped when people saw her approaching. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, whispered something behind her gloved hand to Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store. Their eyes followed Sarah like hawks watching a mouse in an open field. But not everyone stared with cold judgment. Mary Chen, whose family ran the laundry, smiled warmly and waved from across the street. Her gesture felt like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, and Sarah found herself standing a little straighter. Inside the church hall, long tables groaned under the weight of food enough to feed an army. Apple pies sat next to cornbread, while chicken and dumplings steamed beside bowls of green beans seasoned with bacon. The air hummed with conversation and laughter, but when Sarah entered, a hush fell like snow on the gathered crowd. "Well, if it isn't the new Mrs. Kane," said Mrs. Whitmore, the preacher's wife, her voice carrying the kind of sweetness that hid sharp teeth. "How interesting to finally meet you properly." Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her like compass needles pointing north. Her cheeks burned, but she remembered her mother's voice telling her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing what needed doing despite the fear dancing in your chest. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady as bedrock. "Thank you for welcoming me to the community." "Welcoming might be a strong word," muttered Mrs. Patterson from behind her teacup, though she didn't bother lowering her voice. "Some of us remember when marriages meant courtship and proper introductions, not rushed arrangements." The words hit like slaps, but before Sarah could respond, Mary Chen appeared at her elbow like a guardian angel in calico. "Mrs. Kane," Mary said cheerfully, "I've been hoping to meet you. Thomas told my husband you love reading. I have some books I'd be happy to share." "Books?" Mrs. Henderson's voice dripped with disapproval. "How unusual for a woman to spend time reading when there's proper housework to be done." "Knowledge never made anyone a worse person," Sarah replied, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "My mother always said an educated woman could face any storm life sent her way." Several women exchanged glances, and Sarah realized she'd just declared herself different from what they expected. In their world, women were supposed to agree and apologize, not stand firm like trees against wind. The tension might have grown thicker, but suddenly young Billy Morrison came running through the hall, his face bright red and his breath coming in gasps. "Sheriff Kane! Sheriff Kane!" he called out, searching the crowd with desperate eyes. Thomas appeared from where he'd been talking with the men near the back wall. "What is it, Billy?" "There's been trouble at the Parker Ranch," the boy announced, his words tumbling over each other like rocks down a hillside. "Someone rustled their cattle in broad daylight, and Mr. Parker says he knows who did it." The room erupted in concerned voices. Cattle rustling was serious business in their territory, where a man's herd often represented his entire fortune. Sarah watched Thomas's face change from husband to lawman in the space of a heartbeat, his jaw setting with grim determination. "I have to go," he told Sarah quietly, moving to her side with quick steps. "Will you be all right here?" Sarah looked around the room at faces both friendly and cold, feeling like a deer surrounded by wolves and shepherds alike. But Mary Chen stood nearby with encouraging eyes, and she could see other women who seemed more curious than cruel. "I'll be fine," she said, squeezing his hand briefly. "Go do what needs doing." As Thomas hurried toward the door with several other men following behind him, Sarah found herself alone in a room full of women who would either accept her or reject her based on how she handled the next few minutes. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat like a judge calling court to order. "Well, Mrs. Kane," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I suppose we'll see what kind of woman our sheriff has chosen." Sarah felt the weight of every gaze upon her, knowing that her next words would determine whether she found friendship or remained forever an outsider in the community she now called home. The rustlers took 15 head of prime cattle, and they did it bold as brass in the middle of the afternoon. Parker said, his weathered face grim as winter stone, while he stood in Thomas's office 3 hours later. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, it was that no-good Jake Morrison and his boys from up in the hills." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying the rancher's angry features, while rain drummed against the office windows like impatient fingers. Something about Parker's story didn't sit right, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what bothered him like a splinter under the skin. "That's a serious accusation, Parker," Thomas replied carefully. "Jake Morrison's got his problems, but I've never known him to steal cattle. What makes you so certain it was him?" "Saw his horse tracks clear as day leading away from my north pasture," Parker insisted, slapping his hat against his leg for emphasis. That paint horse of his leaves marks different from any other animal in the territory. Through the window, Thomas could see townspeople hurrying through the rain with newspapers held over their heads like makeshift umbrellas. The Sunday social had broken up early when word of the cattle theft spread through the gathering like wildfire through dry grass. "I'll ride out and investigate tomorrow morning when the weather clears," Thomas promised, though doubt continued gnawing at his thoughts like a persistent mouse. "But I won't arrest a man based on horse tracks alone. Need more evidence than that." Parker's face darkened like storm clouds gathering strength. "Evidence? What more evidence do you need? Everyone knows Morrison's been struggling since his wife died." "Desperate men do desperate things, Sheriff." The words hit closer to home than Parker could know. Thomas thought of his own desperation when he'd lost his first wife. The dark months when whiskey seemed like the only friend he had left in the world. But grief didn't automatically make a man a thief, no matter what fear whispered in people's ears. "I said I'll investigate," Thomas repeated firmly. "That's all I can promise until I see the facts with my own eyes." After Parker left, muttering under his breath about sheriffs who wouldn't do their jobs properly, Thomas sat alone in his office listening to the rain and wondering why the rancher's story felt like a boot that didn't quite fit the foot. The door opened with a soft creak, and Sarah stepped inside, shaking raindrops from her shawl like diamonds scattered from heaven. Her cheeks glowed pink from the cold, and her eyes sparkled with something that looked suspiciously like mischief. "How did the rest of the social go?" Thomas asked, grateful for her presence after the unpleasant conversation with Parker. "Better than expected," Sarah replied with a smile that could light up the darkest corners of winter. "Mary Chen invited me to join the women's reading circle, and Mrs. Davidson asked if I'd help teach her daughter to read better." Thomas felt pride swell in his chest like sunrise over mountains. "I told you the town would come around once they got to know you." "Not everyone," Sarah admitted, settling into the chair across from his desk like she belonged there. "Mrs. Henderson made it very clear that she thinks I trapped you into marriage for your money and position." "What did you say to that?" Sarah's grin turned wicked as a cat planning mischief. "I told her that if I'd wanted to trap a man for money, I would have set my sights considerably higher than a small-town sheriff's salary." Thomas burst out laughing despite the weight of the day's troubles. "You didn't really say that." "I most certainly did," Sarah replied with mock dignity. Mary Chen laughed so hard she nearly choked on her apple cider. Their laughter filled the office like warmth from a well-tended fire, but the mood sobered when Thomas told her about Parker's accusations against Jake Morrison. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowing with concentration as she considered the details. "Something troubles you about his story," she observed, reading his expression with the skill of someone learning to know him well. "Everything troubles me about it," Thomas admitted. "Parker's too certain, too quick to point fingers. In my experience, when someone's that eager to blame a specific person, they're usually trying to hide something themselves." "What kind of something?" Thomas stood and walked to the window, watching rain wash the dust from the street while his mind worked through possibilities like a puzzle missing crucial pieces. Could be he's covering for someone else. Could be he's lying about the theft entirely. Or could be he rustled those cattle himself and needs someone to blame. "His own cattle?" Sarah's voice rose with surprise. "Insurance money," Thomas explained grimly. "Some ranchers have been known to hide their own livestock and claim they were stolen, then collect payment from the Territorial Insurance Fund." Sarah joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. "So, what will you do?" "Ride out to Morrison's place first thing tomorrow," Thomas decided aloud. "But I'll also take a careful look at Parker's ranch and see if his story holds water under closer examination." Lightning split the sky outside their window, illuminating the empty street in stark white light. For a moment, everything looked different, sharper, more dangerous, like a world where nothing was quite what it seemed. "Thomas," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a note of worry that made him look down at her concerned face. "Be careful tomorrow. If Parker is lying about something this serious, he might be dangerous when cornered." "I can handle Parker," Thomas assured her, though privately he appreciated her concern more than he could express in words. "I know you can," Sarah replied, reaching up to touch his cheek with fingers soft as butterfly wings. "But I've just found happiness, and I'm not ready to lose it to someone else's lies and greed." As thunder rolled across the territory like God's own judgment, Thomas pulled his wife closer and wondered what tomorrow's investigation would reveal about neighbors who might not be what they seemed in the honest light of day.